Great, welcome everyone who is joining today. As you're joining, it would be great if you can introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name and where you're coming from and what your line of work is, would be great. And I will share my screen. There we go. As you all know, I'm thrilled for today's conversation with David Montgomery and Anne Biklé about their research and especially that in their new book, and we'll talk about that more soon. Wanted to let you know of some upcoming webinars. On May 26th, I'll be speaking with Thomas Garan, who's an ethnobotanist who's lived in China for the last 10 or 15 years, and he'll be kind of providing an inside view of his experience and visits to Chinese farms, growing herbs and processing centers and things like that. And that time actually is 6 to 7 p.m. It's late in order to accommodate the time in Beijing, because Thomas is in Beijing. And then on June 9th, I'm also really excited about this one. I'll be speaking with Arko Chatterjee, who right now has a company, fairly recently formed company, Nature Yuva, which is really working with smallholder farmers using regenerative farming practices. And he has been spending this current month traveling around and visiting those farmers. And as many of you probably know, there's incredible heat waves in India right now. And so he'll be talking about their work in general and his current trip right now. And then I'm also really excited about the webinar on June 16th, which will be with Jane French and Kaelan Atkins-Irby. And Jane French from Numi Organic Tea has been doing a lot around measuring their carbon footprint of Numi tea, and which is specific to botanicals. And so the two of them will be speaking at that webinar on what Numi tea has done and the particular challenges of measuring carbon and taking action on that with sourcing botanicals. And then the following week, Jane will be joining this series we have. It's a discussion series for Sustainable Herbs Program members, where we'll be really diving into the points, what they've learned from their work and brainstorming with other companies who are in some stage of the process, either trying to figure out how to begin measuring their carbon footprint, mostly scope 3 emissions, or how to take action. And if you're interested in that, but you're not a Sustainable Herbs Program member, you can contact me for more information about joining. And my email is ann@herbalgram.org. And as always, these webinars are made possible for free through the generous support of our underwriters, the Sustainable Herbs Program underwriters. And you can find out more about them at the Sustainable Herbs Program website. They're also made possible through the membership support of American Botanical Council members. You can find out more about joining at herbalgram.org. So with that, I am thrilled to get to the topic of today and to speak with David and Anne. And I'm just going to briefly introduce you because I really want to leave time to dig into the work you found. David Montgomery is a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. And Anne is a science writer and public speaker focusing on the connections between people, plants, food, health, and the environment. And their work, they've done a lot of work, but the work in particular that we're focusing on today includes a trilogy of books about soil health, microbiomes, and agriculture. And these books, the first one, which they wrote a little over a decade ago, was Dirt. That was followed by The Hidden Half of Nature, and then What Your Food Ate, which will be available on June 21st. But I luckily was able to read an advance copy. And I hope to finish this book, but unlike a lot of books on soil, I want to read every line, because what a lot of things strike me, but I'll say a few of them. One is the way you combine the specificness of what's happening with the phytochemicals in the soil, and then the why those specifics matter. So, I've been composting for years and mulching for years, but your book is helping me understand why that matters in such specific terms. That makes me want to do more and inspires me to go further. So that was one thing that really strikes me. Another is the way you talk about both the content, but the relationship between how we frame what we're measuring and what we see. And the way by bringing in all these different voices from an incredible amount of research, both your own research and then book research, how you show that maybe we haven't been measuring the right things. Quite often we're not measuring the right things, but there have been people through history that have been, and bringing those voices in. So those 2 points that I want to mention. And then the third is the big picture of why it matters. And halfway through, you have a quotation by Andy Warhol that actually brought tears to my eyes. Having land and not ruining it is the most beautiful art. And it brought tears to my eyes because of how much we've ruined the land. And in your book, you outline all the ways that we have and all the ways we cannot ruin it, regenerate it. So with that brief little introduction, and highly recommending everybody to read this book and purchase it as soon as it's available, June 21st. I wanted to start with another quotation, George Washington Carver, that another one you include, and it says, education is understanding relationships. And so to start, I wondered if you all could just talk about, all your work is about these relationships between soil, crops, livestock, and humans. So if you can jump in and talk about why that matters.
All right, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you about that and about relationships. You know, I think that the real sort of bottom line on the research that came out through the book to us was that, you know, what we do to the land, we do to ourselves, that the health of the land translates into the health of people. And there's a lot of dots in between to try and look at, and it's all about the relationships between the life in the soil and the health and the growth of crops, what's in crops and the health and the growth of livestock, what's in the food that comes from crops and livestock that we then eat, what that does with our microbiome, and how the metabolites that they produce and the other things that get from our food that are affected by what happens on farms end up influencing our health. And there's a whole lot of relationships in between, but you have to understand them and understand them in context to really be able to explain the why between why it matters about how we treat the land, how we treat soil on our farms, and what that does to help tee up our bodies to actually help defend ourselves and maintain our health over a lifetime. So that's why we broke it into those connections of looking at how farming practices affect soil health, how soil health affects crop health, how crop health affects livestock health, and how the latter two of those end up affecting human health. And you know, it really is all about relationships.
Yeah, I think sort of if you had asked me, you know, a decade ago, oh, you guys can be, you know, looking into what your food ate, I would have looked at you and said, what kind of nutty talk are you talking? And then the book Dirt opened this all up. That was largely an effort of Dave's to just, and he even sort of, that book started out a little bit differently than it ended, in that he ended up writing a history of farming. And that's not what he thought it would be. But for anyone out there who's written a book or maybe even an essay, you kind of start out at the beginning with one thing in mind, and there you are at the end, and you go, oh, this is interesting. I didn't really think I'd end up here, but here we are. And then with the hidden half, that really laid open a lot of the new science on microbiomes. That book focuses on both microbiomes of the human body and microbiomes of the plant body and the soil. And that for me was the point at which it opened my eyes to, oh, if there's all of these relationships going on in the human body and in the soil, this is a really big part of health and well-being, way more than I had ever thought. And as a result of writing and researching that book, you'd mentioned you'd mentioned when you started, Anne, you know, some specifics, and that was something you liked about what your food ate, because you start learning about, you know, it's the biology and the chemistry and all of these things that sort of mesh together to make things work. And that's it's really important that those things are able to be happening. And so then Dave wrote another book called Growing a Revolution. And this was visiting farmers around the world who had been pioneering some of these regenerative techniques. In fact, I like to kind of put the two titles together and say, yeah, we're growing a revolution with the hidden half of nature to learn about, why you are what your food ate. So that's kind of a long string. And the big cap on that is because our soil is in trouble, and especially the soil beneath our farms and our gardens, where we're growing all of the plant foods that become a part of the human diet, all of the plant foods that become a part of, an animal's diet as well. So it's been a long journey, and people might have thought, gee, you guys should have started with this book, but we didn't know about all of these relationships to the degree and the depth that we do now, that I think really puts what your food ate as the capstone. I mean, it matters a lot what our food ate. And, I'll leave it kind of at that for now. We can get into some more things maybe in a bit.
Yeah, and the one sort of additional thing I'll add to that is back, and to your point about, the why, and that being so important to understanding. And that's really where I think understanding the why lies in the relationships that people have to all those previous pieces in that chain, from the soil to our food.
Yeah.
So maybe go ahead and dive into the research. What did you find? Both the research you all did, maybe describe that, the farms you compared.
Yeah, so basically what we did, we started by doing, the typical kind of academic research of looking at, well, what have other people found already? Because then we don't have to do it. We can synthesize it and talk about it and think about it. And in doing that, we ran into a whole lot of work along each of those sort of chains of the way, from soil to crops to livestock to people, where studies had looked at sort of a single piece. And there was a lot of good evidence that, certain kinds of compounds, micronutrients, phytochemicals, and the particular mix of fats that are in meat and dairy products end up mattering to human health. And if you kind of work backwards from that, there's pretty good evidence that agronomic practices can influence those things in some cases, but that the connection from soil health as an influence on that was one where there hadn't been as much emphasis in the scientific literature as we would like to find. So what we tried to do, after reviewing all that and sort of teeing up that, oh, these are the kind of things you might expect agronomic practices to have a big influence on. We teed up a small scale sort of exploratory study where we looked at, it was 10 paired farms across the United States, where we had a regenerative farm, some of which were drawn from the farms that I visited right in Growing a Revolution, where we knew of regenerative farmers who had really done an amazing job at bringing their soil back to life, increasing soil organic matter, increasing the health of their land. And we wanted to compare crops they grew to crops grown on conventional farms, either right next door or in proximity to their farms, in comparable soils with a comparable climate in the same year, growing the same crop variety. So we set up this sort of limited field trial, if you will, with successful regenerative farmers, and compared. They each grew a crop that was the same variety that their neighbor was growing. We tested their soil for organic matter, and with the Haney test, a test of soil health that really sort of measures microbial activity in the soil, as just the simplest measures you could make of soil health, not comprehensive. And then we sent the resulting the crops off to a food lab to basically get them tested to see what was in it in terms of mineral micronutrients, minerals, certain vitamins, a suite of phytochemicals, total phytosterols, total polyphenols, and total carotenoids. And we compared the ratios between those paired farms. And we looked at ratios because you wouldn't look at the absolute values of things, because a carrot grown in Connecticut is in very different soil than one grown in Iowa, for example. So you'd look at ratios of the conventional versus regenerative. And what we basically found is that all the regenerative farms had higher soil organic matter and better soil health. And it ranged from, just a little bit better up to, I think, something like 3 times as
I
much.
think it was one was
With-
4, the soil health score was at 4 times.
Yeah, some of the soil health scores are 4 or 5 times higher. And the 2 no-till vegetable farms that we visited had sort of the highest soil organic matter contents, and some of the larger farms had up to 3 times relative to their conventional neighbors. And the sort of larger farms doing sort of more typical large-scale American agriculture, focusing on grain, some corn, some soybeans, sorghum. There's some other crops that were involved in the comparisons. They had soil organic matter contents up on average of between comparable to up to twice as much. So the soil seemed to be, had more organic matter, was healthier soil. And in terms of what we found in terms of the produce, Anne has a set of notes right in front of her.
Yeah, so averaged across all these farms, so I want to be clear, it wasn't, just one farm, but we
Yeah,
averaged.
there's a lot of variability.
Yeah, there's some, we were talking with somebody the other day and they said, what did you find most surprising about, the study and research that you did? And things were highly variable. And at first it's sort of like, is this a problem, or what does all this variability mean? And when you think about it, the variability is really pretty normal. Every single one of us as a human being, we're all quite variable. We're living in different habitats, we're living on different diets, our genomes are different and so on. So it really wasn't that surprising. And coming up a level from all that variability, what we found when we averaged everything across the farms is, I'll just take, I imagine phytochemicals are of interest to the audience. And so we found that with carotenoids, for example, 15% more on the regenerative farms in their crops. Total phenolics, about 20% more. Total phytosterols, about 22% more. And then in vitamins, vitamin K and E, and a couple of B vitamins, it ranged from a high of 34% more vitamin K in the regen crops to the lowest difference was 14%. And then in terms of a couple of minerals, calcium, phosphorus, and copper stuck out as being more in the regen crops. And we kind of have we have a star crop in our study. It was a cabbage comparison done with the regen vegetable farmer out of California. And what was really interesting with their cabbage compared to the regen one, theirs had twice the phenolics, twice the phytosterols, and 48% more carotenoids. And if you'd ever been to this farm, it's called Singing Frogs Farm, and you take a look at it, it just, there's something going on there.
They have beautiful soil.
Yeah, beautiful soil, beautiful crops. Unfortunately, our Connecticut farmer, which is, folks may know of him, it's Brian O'Hara on Tobacco Road Farm, and he's got an equally stunning farm with amazing soil and crops. We were not able, unfortunately, to find a comparison crop to include with Brian's farm, so we just did soil health analyses for his soils. And I did mention variability, and there was 2 areas where the regen crops actually had less of things. One was a B vitamin, B6, and then also manganese. And folks may be interested to know, okay, well, what exactly were these crops? It was the cabbage, of course. Cabbage and peas would be sort of our vegetables. And then we had corn, soy, and sorghum. We were also able, with the vegetable farmers, we found some other data out of the USDA nutrient database, and also a study that had been done in comparing produce from a New York supermarket. And so
Conventional produce
from a New York supermarket. And of course, all of the stuff in the USDA nutrient database is all conventional. And both for that one, we compared the cabbage, carrots, and spinach of the vegetable farmers. And here we were able to use some of Brian O'Hara's, I believe we did spinach and carrots from him. And not too surprising, the regen veggies were just, way better than everything reported in either the nutrient database or that New York supermarket study. So that's, and what we did, it's a small study. It's, if we'd been doing, human biomedical research, this would have been called, proof of concept. This is an idea and a hypothesis that we're testing. And what it tells us is that we need a lot more research like this to be happening, because we know it's just, there's scads and scads of research on, say, the effects of nitrogen fertilizer. Okay, we've pretty much plumbed that topic in the research world. We don't need to know a lot more about that. But what is hardly touched on at all is how agronomic practices, as David been mentioning, how do agronomic practices affect the things in food that are important for human health, not from a caloric standpoint, because here in the Western world, we get plenty of calories, our fats, proteins, and carbs. We're getting ample amounts of those, in some cases too much. But what's going on with the balance of fats in our animal foods? What's going on with the diversity and density of phytochemicals in our plant foods? And along those lines as well, what about, all of these vitamins and minerals? And there's even, if anyone out there is aware of the work of Bruce Ames, he and his group, they're at a children's hospital in Oakland, and there's a whole class of compounds that he calls them longevity vitamins. They're not really the vitamins that you think of when you think vitamin C or one of the B vitamins, but just put it this way, these are compounds that modulate basically processes in our cells that help keep our cells running normally, and most importantly, from sort of middle age onward. So these are your janitorial services, your remodelers, your cleanuppers, your tidy, keep the ship running smooth, running well. Anything breaks, get on that immediately. We want no broken parts, because broken parts just keep, then something else breaks, and then you're stumbling along, and what was a small problem becomes a big problem. So there's a whole class of compounds that we really need to be doing more agronomic research on. And I'm sure in the herbal world, you guys probably have your own set of things that you would really like to have research done on as well, and linking it both to medicinal effects and, of course, soil health.
I want to say one thing. If you have a question, you can drop it in the Q&A, because I'm not able to follow the chat during the conversation. So put those in. I'll save about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So there are two different ways that my mind wants to go, and I'll let you all pick. One is the role of phytochemicals and why we should care, why they matter in the microbiome. And then the other is how agricultural policy, or how our framing and thinking about farming has kind of skewed, it seems obvious, soil health is leading to better plants, but we have this, yield, quality versus quantity.
So can I do the second? You do the first?
Yeah, I was going to say that second question is really important, because it drives the behavior of farmers and eaters. So yeah, let's hit that, and then we can just really briefly touch on the phytochemical thing. Yeah,
and so essentially for the last 80 years or so, we've pretty much, in terms of agronomic policy and agronomic research, prioritized growing high yields of things. And that's been done at the expense of sort of other considerations. And it's been actually quite successful in terms of its primary goal of increasing yields. But as we go into in the new book, there's research dating back to the 1940s looking at how the effect of some of the practices that effort normalized or standardized in terms of, large applications of nitrogen fertilizers, breeding crops to perform well in environments with an excess of nitrogen in the soil, how that essentially shortchanged the pathways and provisioning of things like mineral micronutrients and phytochemical production in crops. And so we essentially we were so focused on high yields and the idea of feeding the world that we kind of let slip the idea that we not only need to feed the world, but we need to nourish the world. And the recognition of that was sort of to go into like the fortification of foods with things that may have been depleted in them. And phytochemicals were the thing that was kind of forgot about or let off the list, or left off the list in terms of a lot of concern, in part because they are not necessary for survival. But there's a lot of evidence that relates to their beneficial effects in terms of maintaining health in people. And in that same period of the last 80 years, where our farming practices and our diet changed, the nature of common human illness has changed as well. We got a good bead on infectious diseases up until fairly recently, given the pandemic. But there's been an explosion of chronic diseases, many of which are rooted in diet and inflammation. And it turns out that mineral micronutrients, phytochemicals, the mix of fats, the things that agronomic practices can affect in foods, as we write about in the book, turn out to be things that have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory capacities. And so a big question is, to what degree has the diminution of those compounds in our food supply as a result of how we've chosen to farm to meet the needs of yield, how much has that actually degraded public health in a diffuse, chronic kind of fashion? And one of the cases we make in the book is that we didn't really have a choice, but it wasn't a simple choice between growing calories and growing nutrient-dense food. It was a choice that was made by ignoring the second part in the exclusion of the first, because there's generally different genes that can be manipulated through crop breeding that affect those different pathways. So we kind of took our eye off the nutrient density ball for a long time, and we're arguing that it's time to put more attention back into that as a way to reverse some of that.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to that, I was earlier in the week taking a look at Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is going to be reauthorized and voted on next year. So this is one of the largest pieces of federal legislation that's out there. And farmers and industry and other people are, talking with congressional committees and stuff right now. And what I thought was really interesting about the testimony and the discussion that I was reading is that nearly all of it was sort of arguing on the pinhead about the prices of subsidies for various crops. And, just to kind of simplify this, like basically all the farmers thought that's not enough money. And then, the pushback was, well, that's all the money we have. Nowhere did I see in any of this testimony or discussion anything even really about food. It much less about nutrient density, much less about public health. And of course, the other really, the two really big parts of the Farm Bill are how much are farmers going to get paid to grow all this stuff. So it incentivizes what Dave was just talking about. Let's grow a lot of crop X because we're getting this price for crop X. So the more we get, the more we grow, the more money we get. The other hand, it's urban populations who are lobbying for things, nutrition assistance, whether that's, I don't know if it's called women, infants, and children anymore, the so-called WIC program and SNAP, food stamps, all that kind of thing. And I sat back and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. We got these two giant pieces of this major legislation. On the one hand, these farmers are not talking about nutrient density and health, and yet we all know that diet plays a huge role in health. And we're talking on the other hand about these populations whose health is generally not that great because their diet is not really great. And what if we jiggered our crops and what farmers are growing and channeled all that stuff over to these populations that are in need of a better diet, a diet that can help prevent disease and ensure, normal growth and development. So anyway, it's just all turned on its head. And this, this is probably not news to your audience, but that's another way in which the way that we frame things affects behaviors. I'm sure some people out there are familiar with Lady Eve Balfour. She was a farmer in the UK around one of Sir Albert Howard's peers. And I always loved her idea that we needed to be having doctors and farmers in conversation and working together, and her radical idea of having a soil scientist, drop into hospitals and be talking about diet and food is really not so radical. And the science just tells us more and more and more that diet-related maladies, conditions, and diseases are preventable. And in some cases, they are reversible. So we've got a long way to go, but in seeing how farmers can turn soil health around and how soil health can turn nutrient density around, it makes me an optimist about this. And I think as sick as many Americans are, they're sick of being sick, that there's a way to, push on this idea of getting crops that are denser with the nutrients. And we really need a different word than nutrients, because that's been so, again, it's another framing, and nutrients are about the things that you need for growth. They're not about the things that you need for health throughout the human lifespan and longevity. And even when Dave earlier had mentioned, phytochemicals, we think those aren't, we don't need them for survival. Actually, I think we need them for a high quality of life. You need them for high quality of life throughout the lifespan. And that's where I want to throw, people may, if you read the book, which by the way is available for pre-order right now, but it's tricky in writing about nutrients because they're so framed in terms of a nutrition lens. Okay, does a person have enough calories? So that means proteins, fats, and carbs. Rarely do they ask, does the person have enough, ergothioneine, for example? This is a compound made by soil organisms that gets taken in by crops. And what about, the hundreds, if not thousands of other compounds that plants deliver into the human diet that we don't even know about? Yeah. And actually that's kind of a brief segue over to the other question about phytochemicals and what do they do in our bodies and why do we want them in high levels in plants? And how does all this work? I found it really interesting that phytochemicals, of course, they're part of the plants. It's the grand plan of the botanical world for defense and health, right? We know this about, beta carotene helps protect from sun, and other phytochemicals do these kinds of defensive things. But the other thing that's happening in the botanical world with phytochemicals is that these are signaling compounds. It's the words and the language that they use to communicate with the soil microbiome, especially in the rhizosphere, this very close zone right around the roots. So it's not just direct defense, it also plays a huge role in communication. And so we want phytochemicals high in the human food supply because they then come into our bodies. This is fascinating. And because they're plant foods and we're pretty poor at digesting whole plant foods. So they sail through our digestive tract, they hit the colon, the microbiome is down there, tranquil grazing pastures, fermenting this stuff, breaking it down, including the phytochemicals that are bound to the different kinds of fiber in plant foods. So they're fermenting and they're transforming these phytochemicals into other compounds. And, it's these microbial metabolites have their origins in phytochemicals that are turned into other things in our colon that are then put out into the rest of our body. And I think this helps explain to a certain extent, there's research on phytochemicals where, it's like kind of unclear at the end of an experiment or something like, well, it wasn't exactly the phytochemical in the chemical form that it came into the body, it was this other thing. And we don't know, in all cases, does this phytochemical get turned into this thing? And that again goes back to the variability of the human microbiome and what kind of a crew you have working on your behalf down there. So just wanted to slip that phytochemical thing in there because it's a hugely important topic. And with the diversity of the plant world, even though the human diet is shrunk down in terms of the diversity of plant foods that we eat, we still have a microbiome. We still got to eat. And so I'm all for having the microbiome be getting as many different phytochemicals as possible so that we can get our internal pharmacists, churning out their products.
Thank you. I want to circle back again to the farming for a second. Maybe it'll circle back to phytochemicals. This was also a question, but it's one I had as well about when we spoke last week. You talked about different farmers and the farming practices and what it takes, why farmers are farming conventionally when probably they know that the soil is becoming dirt, and what keeps them stuck, and the ones that you met who were able to make the transition, what that takes, or just your thoughts about all of why people farm what they do.
So I mean, one of the little appreciated sort of historical realities of what brought us modern conventional farming is that the era of time, late 19th, early 20th century, in which sort of the roots of modern agrochemical agriculture were sort of set down and then blossomed after the Second World War. We're landing at a time when soils across Western Europe and North America had already been degraded by generations of tillage. And that's what the Dirt Book was about, was looking at how the over application of tillage over the long haul had degraded soils to the point that yields were falling. People were complaining about yields going down in the 19th century. And chemical fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, were big yield boosters in degraded soils. And they still are big yield boosters in degraded soils. But one of the problems with the over application and reliance on them is that the over-reliance on soluble forms of nitrogen fertilizer tends to short circuit the kinds of partnerships that crops form with mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And there's solid reasons behind that. But it also can stimulate bacterial decomposition of soil organic matter, which is essentially the food that helps feed the soil microbiome. And so the over-reliance on nitrogen fertilizers can boost yield in the short run, but it degrades soil, native soil fertility in the long run. And of course, what that means is that farmers get hooked on them. The more you use, the more you need. And pesticides are fairly similar for similar reasons that would take longer to explain. But so part of what got us into modern conventional agriculture is we'd already degraded our soils, and that was a stopgap to reboost yields. And that, and I'm sorry, I forgot the first premise. I was trying to get to the premise of your question. I forgot where you actually started.
Yeah, kind of why are farmers and we all wonder, right? Why are they stuck like this? Why are they doing this?
Yeah, and so basically, farmers have gotten caught in both that problem, the sort of the more you use, the more you need kind of a problem, but also if you think about where farmers are today. They don't control the price they get for their crops. They've been encouraged to specialize in just growing one or two crops, a small number of crops. And they've been trained to rely on agrochemical inputs and diesel, all of which is getting more and more expensive. So they've become very good at growing very few crops, which has depressed the price they get for commodity crops while their expenses have gone up. So there's a lot of farmers now who are interested in ways that you could actually cut and reduce reliance on expensive inputs. And when I was writing Growing a Revolution, I visited some of these regenerative farmers who have been pioneering methods for doing that. And they have, what I found was that there's a recipe, in effect, a recipe of minimal disturbance, planting cover crops, or keeping living roots in the soil at all, throughout the seasons, and growing a diversity of crops. And that farmers who had adopted that combination of practices were very successful at rebuilding their soil organic matter because they're not disturbing soil life, they're feeding soil life, and they're feeding a diverse team of fungi and bacteria in the soils with the diversity of crops that they're growing, because each plant will essentially recruit particular microbial partners through their exchanges through their root system. And that system of cultivating beneficial life can bring the soil back to life, can greatly reduce the need for inputs, and it can actually maintain harvests. And where we went with the new book is to look at what that does to actually what gets into food. And it turns out that the same kind of things you would do to rebuild soil organic matter and cultivate beneficial soil life are the things that you would do to try and re-stimulate the symbioses that actually between soil life and plant life that increase the mineral, vitamin, and phytochemical content of foods.
And so what is in the book, you do a brilliant job describing what's going on in the rhizosphere and all of that. Like finally started to click for me. But to stay, so the conventional farmers are those kind of that you visited that were understanding there was problems, but what helps them begin to take steps? Or
Yeah. So how do you break out of this? I mean, one of the things that has always struck me about, reading agronomic research, you'll come across people talk about farming systems, like which farming system are we going to study in this, this experiment? And what Dave was just talking about is obviously that's the conventional agricultural system. And it's got its own recipe, and it's a very predictable recipe, and it works really well if you've got soils that are depauperate in soil life, low in soil organic matter, and plants that are sitting there stranded without a microbiome, nobody to talk to or communicate with. If that were me, I would need crutches, I would need some kind of virtual glasses, I would need a lot of help, a lot of inputs to get around and live my life. So as we all know, you can get a plant to grow with a lot of fertilizer and under those conditions. I mean, that is what we're doing with modern agriculture. I think farmers that have broken out of that system and are doing different things, sometimes, usually, if things are going well and you're making a profit, why change your system, right? The routine more or less is working from the standpoint of the bottom line. It might not be working for human health or the planet, but it's working for your checking account. So that keeps going on. But a crisis hits, like say maybe a war, in which fertilizer is made by a certain country that is now, withholding it. And so all of a sudden your fertilizer prices are, late last year, it was maybe they were doubled. Well, if you take a poking around into the price of nitrogen fertilizer today, I mean, we're well into the growing season for certain parts of the world. And it's like, 3 times, 4 times. Oh, now we can't even get it at all. I mean, this is what Brazil is facing. And this is awkward. This is shocking. This is a huge motivator for change. I liken it to, any one of us who's gotten, some kind of, say, a medical or health diagnosis. Either you ignore it, or you're like, oh, I think I'm going to change. I think it's time to change right now. And a farmer isn't going to see changes overnight. And likewise, a person isn't either if you decide you're going to do something in the face of information in a crisis. But over time, and this is the neat thing about soil, you start returning organic matter to the soil through the recipe that Dave described, the cover crops, diversity, and living roots. And the microbiome gets back up on its tiny little feet pretty darn quickly. Like anyone over a season, you put a lot of organic matter out there, and then, by the next growing season, you start to see little changes. You do that, a second year in a row, a third year, a fourth year. And that's where some of these farmers who have made this transition from the conventional system to a different kind of a system, which, sort of currently we're calling something between, regenerative, or I would put the very best organic farmers in this category too. They figured this out. And so they've gone from a dead soil to a living soil. And when you go from a dead to a living soil, your inputs, the need for the crutches and the virtual glasses and all of the crap that keeps these crops propped up long enough to get to a finish line, you do away with all that stuff, and the crop can march itself right to the finish line of harvest. And these regenerative farmers, I will tell you this, they really like not spending money on inputs. Anyone out there likes not spending money on inputs and getting a better product by the end of it. I mean, how often does that happen? So that's how you get them to change. And then just one other comment on this whole notion too of a system and the labels that we put on farmers and farming. I understand why we want certified organic, because we need to know how our food is grown. And this book is making the point of how important it is what our food ate. So I I thoroughly believe in the need for, certification of practices, but I think it also keeps farmers locked in some ways. And what you see these conventional farmers doing who are stepping out of the conventional system is they're grabbing practices from all over and they're adapting them to their crop, their farm, and their local conditions. And I almost think it's not really worth asking, oh, does that mean you're an organic farmer? No, the better question is, just tell me what you're doing for this outcome that we all want, that outcome being better soil health in the future, now and in the future. So whatever methods you're doing that by, however you're getting your dead soil back to life in a sustainable way, and in a way that is not some weird thing that often happens. We're going to take this toxic thing and call it a nutrient. We're going to put it in the soil and, look, no. Real living soil. So that's how they start to step out of these systems and begin changing their practices, and helping themselves and helping the rest of us too, I think.
That's great. Thank you. There's a question that's related to that, so I'll just answer it now. How do you respond to the criticism that you need high yield? Let's go back to the yield question, to provide enough supply, that you can't meet that demand with organic farming practices? Or
yeah, well, I wrote extensively about that in Growing a Revolution, and the regenerative farmers that I visited for that weren't technically organic farmers. Just I think one was, if I recall right. But they were what I called organic-ish farmers. They had so weaned themselves off of agrochemicals that they're hardly using any. But their yields were comparable, if not greater, than their conventional neighbors. So, and if you actually go back, which we do in the new book, and What Your Food Ate, and you look at some of the studies that are the root of the idea that organic yields are lower than conventional yields, on average, that is what you find when you do the sort of the meta studies of all the organic and all the conventional studies, put them in each one in their own little blender and compare the net yields. People argue there's, a 10 to 20% yield gap. But if you actually look and parse those studies and look at the study, and there's the one study looked at fully half of the comparisons, the organic yields were as big, if not higher, than the conventional ones. And the things that are usually left off the table when considering the yield gap and what it might actually be is what's the state of the soil. And there's plenty of organic farms that have degraded their soil. And there's plenty of those comparisons of organic versus conventional farms where they grow a conventional crop variety in a soil treated organically that had been conventionally farmed for 100 years and just converted. So the state of the soil was essentially conventional, but it was labeled organic in the comparison because it was treated organic that year. So much of the conventional wisdom about the difference between organic and conventional farming is sort of rooted in the premise that we're going to be growing food in degraded soil. And organic crops and organic methods don't do really well in degraded soil. Why? Because they depend on soil life and soil health for much of the nutrient cycling that actually helps promote not only high yields, but nutrient density. And when you actually look, there's one study that looked at trying to, how much could the yield gap be trimmed down? And they were getting down to 3% kind of levels on average. But there's lots of comparisons where organic has outproduced conventional, but it's just not the majority of comparisons. The majority go the other way. And so we were finding there was hardly any yield gap between these regenerative farmers and their conventional neighbors, and that the gap went the other way. The regenerative ones were outproducing their conventional neighbors. So I think, and of course, there's a transition period in terms of if you have degraded soil, you're not going to get comparable yields until you rebuild soil fertility. So I view the challenge not so much as the question of can organic or regenerative feed the world relative to conventional, as much as a question of how do we transition conventional farmers to organic and or regenerative, more soil health building practices in a way that will allow us to keep feeding the world into the future. And it's about engineering resilience back into the agricultural system.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I'd add to that, so if we're talking about a yield gap, juxtapose that with the factoid that we seem to throw away somewhere between 30 and 40% of the food that's grown. So is there a yield gap or is there a waste problem? Yeah.
Well, basically you could solve the yield gap problem by wasting less food.
Yeah, we could reduce our waste size too.
Yeah.
It goes back to that quotation, education is understanding all these relationships. And then it can get overwhelming to know which one to start with, right?
Yeah.
And then just one more thing on this yield issue. Modern times we're growing crops that are largely bred to be able to, survive and grow and get to the harvest finish line in these pretty awful soils. And so these crops are essentially, they're bred to respond to inputs, to the agrochemicals and the fertilizers. But what about this? What if we bred crops so that we're enhancing all of the different ways, all of the genes that code for signaling compounds that allow them to communicate with their microbiome and tee up all of the defensive stuff and the protective stuff that puts more nutrients into our food. And we just don't really look at plant breeding that way, unless it's usually some one-off thing like we need more vitamin A in rice, so let's tinker with the genes, around vitamin A, instead of how about if we enhance and protect how plants are communicating with their microbiome so that we get this whole biological conversation and intelligence operating, functional, and resilient. And that's what I would like to see personally.
I'm also trying to read some of these questions to give a moment, because we're coming to the end of the hour. We could talk forever. There are a couple about specific practices. One was somebody was asking about homemade biochar, and someone else wondered if you have recommendations for, I think this is for home gardeners, or small farms, or where you point people. I'll point people to your book for fantastic understanding of what's going on, and then you talk some about what to do about it, but I wonder if there's more farming direct things.
I pioneered some at the time. Didn't even think I had no name for them, and I realized now, oh, maybe I was doing regenerative gardening before I knew that that's what it had a name. And so my method was economical. I thought it was pretty efficient. It took some muscle power, but wood chips. Okay, so we know all the soil life thrives on organic matter. That's either organic matter coming in the form of exudates of plants, or it's the physical organic matter that you're bringing either into your garden, or you're letting plants in your garden or farm drop their dead parts, and then you're keeping that stuff on site. And so what I ended up doing early on when we put a garden in, we didn't have enough plants here to be generating their own organic matter. And so I became friends with arborists. And I liked arborists who had different loads of wood chips on their truck. They would dump them in the driveway, and then I would take these wood chips and I would mix them with other types of organic matter that I had on hand in an urban environment. And so that was everything from, neighbors' dead leaves to we have zoo doo, which is animal manures from the zoo for the ornamental part of the garden. And someone had asked me, I saw that you mentioned biochar. I got a hold of some biochar and I mixed that in. And basically, I'm not like a perfect composter, but I do like to just always remember more carbon than nitrogen in your mulch mix. And I wasn't setting this stuff off to compost and then applying it. I was sheet mulching on the beds, and I was not digging it in. Initially, I thought I was going to do that. And there's like, wait a minute, that's nuts. There's no time, there's no labor. And so I just sheet mulched this stuff, and it decomposed in place. All the microbes and other forms of soil life helped decompose and break that down. And I never looked back ever since. And I've had virtually, it's not been disease and pathogens that have taken out any plants in the garden. What it has been is the gardener, in one case, put too much mulch on the tree. Bad, 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 bad. So if you've got, perennials, and I'm thinking, maybe some people are growing herbs and things like that, it's just keeping an eye, thinking about your soil as having a metabolism. And so you don't really serve up a giant plate of mulch. You serve up a plate for that meal and you keep your eye on it through the growing season. You apply more as needed. And the reason wood chips are kind of the base for my mulch recipe is that this really gets the fungi going. I'm sure there's some people out there who've read Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Fungi. And so if not, I recommend that. Fungi do all these amazing things. And they happen to really, certain types of saprophytes, the decayers, really enjoy living on wood chips. And these are things that, arborists, at least in the Seattle area, they're going to have to pay to go dump these. So you raise your hand and you're saying, no, you come to my house and you leave them here and, I'll take care of them.
Great, thank you. There's a lot of questions and we're coming to the end, so we're not gonna have time. I don't know if you can answer this in 1 minute or two, but someone's asking about, going back to your points about resilience, and how does one measure that in the plant, food, herbal health?
Wow.
Other ways to measure, and you can pass if you can't get to that.
I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but in terms of, if you're looking at sort of resilience in terms of human health, I'd be looking at, well, which phytochemicals and which herbs, and look at the density or the concentration of them in that. In terms of resilience of actually growing things, the best sort of metrics for resilience and healthy soil that I can think of that are simple are just the soil organic matter content and something like a Haney test, a soil health test. They're simple, they're fairly cheap to do. And the basic idea is that the higher you score on both for your environment, the more resilient your soil and whatever you're growing it is likely to be.
Yeah. The other thing I would say about that is, I'm sure folks who are growers out there in your audience, they live somewhere. There's likely other farms or gardens around them, and they maybe know these people or are friends with them. And there's always, this is what I love about farmers and gardeners, the first thing you talk about is, what are you doing there? How come that looks so good? Or, hey, why is your plant dying? My plant's not dying. You need to be doing this or that. And so I love the peer-to-peer learning, because chances are, at least, if you're in proximity, you're starting with maybe the same kind of soil, and you can learn about what another person is doing to either battle a pathogen, a disease, or get these plants just, growing gangbusters and rambunctiously like you want. So I'm always one for on the ground learning from another person. It's really, and most farmers are more than willing. They do farm schools. So these are, and I don't know if the herbalists do this too, but in the summertime, they frequently have like a several-day farm school where you go to that farm and you learn all about their methods and what works.
Interesting. For the last question, this was partly a question, but I'm also curious. I had this question too, about where you think it's overwhelming, the amount of information, and it's hopeful, but it's also the forces against it are making these changes from dead to living soil is overwhelming. And I wondered what each of you think, maybe starting with you, David, where we are on that journey toward moving to really care.
Well, when I wrote Dirt back in 2007, nobody was talking about soil health. It was kind of a crazy thing to be even bringing up, even in a book about soil and its history. And now you go to farming conferences and, the hot topics are soil health and what to do about it. And so I think we're on the sort of we're still on the early adopter phase of sort of, the big transitions of early adopters, and then you get the mean, and then maybe you never get everybody at all, at the far end. But I think we're poised for a couple decades of growing adoption of the idea of regenerative farming is not only good for the planet, but good for the farmer, and also good for the consumers that are eating what the farmers grow. And what turned me into an optimism that we're going to see an increasing acceleration of adoption of more regenerative style practices, and a gradual move making conventional farming sort of closer to organic farming as a result of that, is that it seems to be working out economically for farmers.
Yeah, and I'm drawing a little picture here that I'm going to show because I like to do that kind of thing. And so there we are on the limb, the so-called ascending limb. We're not at the beginning anymore with this soil health stuff. We're climbing up there. We're going to reach a plateau, and then we're going to go even higher. That's what I think is happening. And the time span, I don't know, the next decade and a half or so. I mean, we need it and the planet needs it. So I don't really see how we're going to get around this. And yeah, soil life is where it's at.
It's fantastic. Thank you all so much for this conversation and for everybody who joined and the many questions that we didn't get to. I'm sorry. And I want to again remind everyone to read this book. Somebody did ask which of your books to start with. Or what, if you were going to read one, which one?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you could start anywhere. I mean, I'd say pick it up, open it up. If it grabs you, keep going. There's not any right order, so to speak.
Yeah, if you're really interested in the history, dirt's a good place to start. If you're really interested in microbes and symbioses, Hidden Half of Nature is a good place to start. If you want to meet some interesting regenerative farmers around the world, Growing Revolution is a good place to start. But if you're just interested broadly in it and you're comfortable waiting until June, a few weeks until the new book is out, that's a great place to start too, because we tried to synthesize what we did in the previous books and then lay on the element of human health. So What's Your Food Aid is sort of the higher level look that has the benefit of all we learned along the way. But if you read the books in the order we published them, you'll actually re-experience the intellectual journey that we were on in learning stuff, because we never anticipated writing more than one book on soil. And we're now on number 4.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you all so much. And we'll share the recording with everyone tomorrow and a link to where you can pre-order the book.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Thanks a ton, Anne. It was really fun to be with you.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.